By the Fire presents A Desperate Soul by Dave Smale. Read for you by the author. Chapter 2. 11 years later. All he knew was he no longer had a mom or a dad, and he'd never get to meet his baby sister. That was enough, she decided. Tilda could never bring herself to share the gory details of that tragic night. After the proverbial smoke cleared from the accident, the insurance companies and lawyers got their hands tangled up in the matter. There was much to deal with, not the least of which was Jacob's guardianship. Jacob had 3 other grandparents besides Tilda, as well as an uncle on his mother's side and an aunt on his father's side. However, he'd never met any of them. His aunt and uncle lived in Maine and Ohio, respectively. It was the distance that kept them away, or so they said. Nevertheless, each time Rick and Molly had offered to visit, they were met with a series of ridiculous excuses. They took the hint after so many tries. Jacob had never met his paternal grandparents either. They'd all but disowned his father when he became a Christian. They were engineers and staunch atheists. When Rick came to a Christmas family gathering and began talking about Jesus, they asked him to stop. He politely asked how they could meet on Christmas and not discuss the person who was the reason for the holiday. His father told him to leave and not to talk to them ever again, that is, unless he was ready to recant his newfound religion. They hadn't spoken since. Rick had tried to communicate with them several times, but his parents showed an impressive capacity for holding a grudge. They hadn't responded to the wedding invitation or the baby announcement, not even a congratulatory phone call. They showed up to the funeral, at least that's what Jacob was told. If they really did come, they hadn't bothered to introduce themselves. That left Jacob's grandfather on his mother's side, Tilda's husband. Jacob didn't know much about him except that he had been out of the picture for a long time. Since Tilda and his parents had a policy of never bad-mouthing anyone, they rarely spoke of the man at all. All Jacob could deduce was his grandpa had left Tilda soon after she'd become a Christian. Her new righteous and holy lifestyle wasn't conducive with his drinking. When it came down to it, he'd had to decide who he loved more, his wife or the bottle. It had been nearly 20 years since she'd seen him. Since Rick and Molly had never finalized a living will, the state of Virginia decided that their life insurance policy would be used to pay for the balance of their mortgage. That left precious little for the sole beneficiary, whom was Jacob. Their savings account was placed in an annuity, which accrued a whopping 1% interest and was transferred into Jacob's name, though he was not able to touch it until he was 18. Rick's business was sold by the state of Virginia. The state paid his business debts, which were few, and then paid themselves in the form of taxes. The remainder was placed into the annuity. It was also decided that Tilda would be the best caregiver for Jacob. At first it seemed that things would work out well, despite the bitter circumstances. Jacob spent dozens, maybe hundreds, of nights curled up like a baby on his grandmother's lap, as they cried themselves to sleep. The pair were in indescribable pain and relied on each other for healing. However, Tilda also relied on her prayers and fellow churchgoers for support. Jacob found it difficult making friends with the other kids in the church. Not because they were unfriendly, but because they all had parents. It wasn't fair, he decided. He'd never tried prayer. He couldn't bring himself to start. Gradually, Jacob grew distant, retreating into an emotional shell where Tilda's love was powerless to reach him. The older he got, the more he wanted to be alone, detached, distant, as if building a wall between his life prior to his parents' death and life now. His school grades slid. Jacob seemed uninterested in everything. His expression was often despondent. In desperation, Tilda bought him an Xbox, but not even video games could hold his attention for longer than a few minutes. There was only one thing that he seemed to like doing: playing guitar. Jacob's parents had given him a guitar, amplifier, and lessons for his 7th birthday. He'd asked for them while not really expecting to get them, but they'd come through. He'd proved to be a quick study and relished his lessons. After the accident, Tilda and Jacob's guitar teacher agreed that Jacob should take a break from his lessons indefinitely. To their astonishment, he'd asked to start them again within a month. Jacob often came home from school and immediately retired to his room, then spent hours with headphones plugged into his amplifier, playing and tuning out everything but his own noise. Church was another matter entirely. At school he was uninterested, but at church he was angry. It was the only place where his distant gaze changed to a bitter scowl. Tilda had tried to talk to him about it, but to no avail. He'd simply retreat to his room and play his guitar. Empathizing with Jacob's struggle, his guitar teacher gave him several CDs of, quote, stellar guitar players, as well as various old-school heavy metal bands. Jacob loved them all. He listened to Joe Satriani, Steve Vai, and Yngwie Malmsteen on repeat, picking apart their styles while developing his own. He especially loved the older heavy metal bands like Slayer and Sepultura and Metallica and Megadeth. His taste changed over time. He found himself liking gothic metal bands such as Type O Negative, We Are the Fallen, and HIM, which stood for His Infernal Majesty. He wasn't into death metal, electronica, or punk rock. Jacob and his teacher kept the CDs hush-hush. They both knew Tilda wouldn't approve. Not that she minded rock and roll. She'd lived through the 70s. But the lyrical content was definitely forbidden. As he'd entered his teenage years, Jacob's guitar playing increased, along with his passion. He simultaneously developed a desire to be in a band, while a distaste for school. He began to show defiance and disrespect toward authority figures, especially Tilda. When he was 15, he flat out refused to come to church with her any longer. She was hurt, but not naive. She'd seen it coming. Jacob somehow passed his 9th and 10th grade years with C averages. In 11th grade, he developed a new bad habit: not coming home after school. Often, he'd stay out until just before the citywide curfew of 11 o'clock on school nights. On weekends, he wouldn't come home at all. Tilda tried talking to him, but it didn't work. She tried grounding him, but he ignored her punishments and left anyway. She tried locking him out of the house, but he figured out how to break into his room from outside, undetected. When it seemed as though she had no leverage, she refused to pay for any more guitar lessons. It didn't even faze him. By that time, he was so good, he could have given lessons himself. One night he came home with bleached white hair and a ring through his lower lip. When she saw that, Tilda gave up trying to reach him. Instead, she decided to manage the chaos until he was old enough to move out. It pained her to see what had become of her beloved grandson. All she could do now was continue to pray for him. And she figured it wouldn't hurt to do a little investigative work. Tilda learned from a friend at church, whose daughter was Jacob's classmate, that he'd joined a, quote, goth metal band, whatever that was. The band had garnered a significant local following, even headlining a few shows recently. Additionally, he'd landed a job at a local music store, one that seemed to hire anyone who looked young and eccentric. Tilda didn't know what was more astonishing: all she'd learned about Jacob, or how the girl had uncovered all of that with a few taps on her smartphone. During his senior year, Jacob dropped out, opting to work his job and play in his band instead of graduating. He'd given forged paperwork to his school purporting that he'd been emancipated. Anxious to wash their hands of such a troublemaker, the school administrators didn't question the document's authenticity and didn't bother verifying Tilda's signature. She'd only found out on a day when she'd come home early from work to find Jacob still asleep. When she'd tried to rouse him, he nonchalantly told her that he didn't go to school anymore. After a 10-minute yelling match, during which Tilda began to cry, Jacob said what he had wanted to say for a long time. "Why should I ever do anything you say?" he declared. "You never even told me what happened to my parents." Through tears, she looked at him in astonishment. "What do you mean? You know what happened. They were in a car accident." "No, I mean the details. Was it their fault? Did they hit someone? What happened? You won't even tell me." "Jacob, you don't." "What?" Jacob said, cutting her off. "You're going to say, I don't want to know? Yes, I do. It's not right for you to keep it from me all this time." "Please," Tilda began to sob loudly as the events of that night began to invade her memory. Jacob uncaringly pressed her all the more. "So?" he demanded. "I can't believe you," she cried, holding her belly. "They were my parents." "And your mother was my daughter. Don't you think it hurts me too? I was the one who had to go to the morgue and identify—" She began sobbing loudly once again. Jacob impatiently waited for her to continue, his arms crossed and his foot tapping. Finally she said, "Fine. You want to know? I'll tell you. They were on their way home from a date night." "Yeah, I know," he interrupted. "I remember that much." "Will you let me finish? My goodness. Anyway, they went to a restaurant on Virginia Beach Boulevard but didn't know it had gone out of business. So they went to a different restaurant over in Chesapeake. Your mother sent me a text to let me know, but I didn't see it until much later. They were on I-64 when a semi-truck driver on the other side of the road fell asleep at the wheel. He was going over 90 miles an hour when he woke up. He slammed on the brakes but lost control. The truck turned sideways, then flipped over the median into oncoming traffic. The police said it happened so fast that your father never had a chance to react. The trailer landed right on top of their car." Jacob's face paled. He wasn't prepared for the details as he thought. Nausea set in quickly. "They were crushed, Jacob," Tilda finished in a whisper. Almost forgetting Jacob had asked, she continued recounting the grim details, as if she was retelling the story to herself. It had been years since she'd allowed herself to think about it. "I couldn't identify either of them when the coroner pulled the sheet back. It was the most awful thing I had ever seen. They were unrecognizable." "Okay," murmured Jacob. Tilda didn't hear him. "There was so much blood. When the coroner said the baby didn't make it, I fainted." "Okay, I said," he cried. "When I came to, I was on a couch. You were next to me. You remember that?" "Yes, now please stop," Jacob wailed. "Well," Tilda said solemnly, "you asked." "Yeah, and now I'm sorry I did." "Jacob, I don't know why things happened the way they did. I miss them every single day. But what I do know is that I have been blessed to spend every moment with you these past years. The Lord has been very good to me." "How dare you say that?" he erupted. He startled her, but she instinctively deflected his rage. "When terrible situations happen, it's always best to find anything good that has happened as a result," she replied, with a calmness uncharacteristic of someone who just recounted the most traumatic event of their life. "No, that's a bunch of crap. Every time you don't understand something, you just fall back on your stupid religion like a crutch." "Believe me, My relationship with God is not a crutch, and you know that. That was an incredibly difficult time. You remember all the nights we spent crying? I questioned God several times during that. Oh, yeah? You did? And did your God ever answer you? Jacob demanded. She eyed him. Yes, she answered. Oh, really? Let me guess, Jacob inflected sarcastically. He told you everything was going to be okay because Jesus, blah, 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 and we're all going to be together in heaven one day. No, not exactly. But God did give me a lot of peace and strength through it all. And he gave me... Jacob cursed loudly. Tilda gasped. Obscene language was not permissible in her house. Until now, she'd given him a measure of grace, knowing that bringing up his parents' death was akin to refracturing a healed femur. But when he cursed, she drew the line. Young man, first of all, you will not speak that way in my house. Second, I'll say whatever the hell I want. Tilda gasped again. Jacob! His eyes narrowed, a dastardly smirk crossing his lips. Oh, that's right. That word bothers you too, doesn't it? Worse than the F word or the S word. 'Cause you actually believe in the place. Well, here you go. Jacob proceeded to repeat the word hell multiple times until she begged him to stop. I've had enough of your rules, your stupid little church games, he said. I'm out of here. Fine, just be back by curfew, she wailed. You don't get it. I'm not coming back. Ever. What? But you can't do that. You're a minor, she protested. Watch me. I'll be 18 in a couple months, Jacob said, turning and storming down the hallway. Several picture frames swayed as he passed. Tilda stood, aghast, holding her aching abdomen and staring at an empty hallway with swinging pictures like something out of a horror movie. Jacob noisily rummaged in his room, cursing under his breath. Tilda knew things hadn't been going well, but never thought it would come to this. Jacob emerged a minute later with a backpack slung over his shoulder, a guitar case in one hand, amplifier in the other. Evidently, he'd prepared for this moment. He nearly ran her over as he rounded the end of the hallway and made for the front door. Out of the way, he snarled. Where are you going? She asked. Like I'd freaking tell you, he said, practically kicking the front door open. She tailed him out to the driveway. He cursed again. Quit following me, he called over his shoulder, and then added, Why don't you just die? She stopped cold, halfway down the driveway. As a Christian, she'd encountered plenty of hostility in her time, but never had anyone wished death on her, let alone someone about whom she deeply cared. As her grandson pronounced his death wish, a Bible scripture popped into her mind. It was from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. O death, where is your sting? Here it is, she thought. Hearing her only real family member wish for her death stung, no doubt about it. Her limbs felt like stone, and her heart ached. Actually, it wasn't her heart, it was in her lower abdominal region, but that wasn't relevant. Tilda was unsure of her next move. Should she try talking him into coming back and working things out, or just let him go? As she delayed, Jacob reached the sidewalk, set the amplifier down, and fished a smartphone from his pocket. Tilda hadn't known he'd owned one until the daughter of one of her church friends showed her his vulgar social media postings. Jacob tapped the screen a few times, slipped it back into his pocket, picked up his amplifier, and casually strolled to the end of the block, without so much as a backward glance. Tilda broke free from her statue-like trance and darted to the edge of the driveway. She watched as an old light blue and primer black coupe pulled up to the curb where Jacob sat atop his amplifier. Within 30 seconds, he'd loaded all his worldly belongings in the car and was gone. Her heart sank. Her belly hurt worse now. Tilda felt like life itself was slipping from her. In her grief, she did the only thing she knew to do in desperate situations. She prayed, her eyes filling with tears. Dear God, please Please keep my Jacob safe, and please, somehow, bring him back to me. Hey, it's Jacob. I'm not a real rock star, but I might loosely be based on the author, who's also not a rock star. Hey, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes and tell you about Anchor. If you haven't heard about it, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. First off, it's free. Also, there's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast, like right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast so it can be heard on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership, and it's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm right now to get started. You've been listening to By the Fire. Hey, tell us what you think. Leave us a review on Apple, Spotify, Google, or wherever you download your podcasts. Or send me an email. info@davesmail.com. info@davesmail.com. Thank you so much for listening. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.